You know, there's this mystery that's been kicking around for almost 2,000 years. It's a rumor about the Gospel of Matthew, that the Greek version we all have isn't the original. The legend says there's a lost Hebrew version out there. Well, today, we're opening the case file on this ancient puzzle to see if the evidence actually holds up.
So this is the big question. Was the Gospel of Matthew originally written in Hebrew? A lot of people have made some pretty big claims, especially in the last few decades, pointing to one specific manuscript that they say solves everything. But does it really? We're going to follow the evidence, step by step, and see exactly where it leads us.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to trace the legend of this lost gospel right back to its source. Then, we'll meet our prime suspect, a manuscript called the Shem Tov Matthew. After that, we dive into the evidence, Exhibit A and B, looking at everything from linguistic fingerprints to some serious theological tampering. Finally, we'll look at the strong case for a Greek original before we reach our final verdict. Let's get into it.
So, first things first. Where did this whole idea of a Hebrew Matthew even come from? Well, it didn't start with some amazing archaeological find. Nope. It started with just a single kind of vague comment from an early church father, a comment that basically took on a life of its own.
Think of it like a giant, centuries-long game of telephone. It all kicks off around 13 AD with this one guy, Papias. Decades later, another writer, Irenaeus, repeats what he said. Then another guy, Tertullian, echoes the same thing. And get this, he flat out says he learned it by tradition. They're all just passing along a rumor that seems to lead back to one single, unverified source.
And here's the real kicker. Papias, the original source, never even said Matthew wrote a gospel. He used the Greek word logia, and logia doesn't mean a full story with a narrative arc. It means sayings or oracles, more like a collection of quotes. So right from the very beginning, the foundation for this whole legend is incredibly shaky. Okay, now let's jump forward more than 1,000 years. In the 14th century, this Hebrew text of Matthew suddenly appears on the scene, and today, some people are claiming this is the long-lost original. This is our main suspect, the Shem Tov Matthew. But its origins are, well, let's just say they're not what you'd expect for a pristine first-century document.
The context here should set off alarm bells everywhere. This text wasn't discovered carefully preserved in some ancient library. It was published inside a book written specifically to argue against Christianity, a debate manual for Jewish scholars. Its purpose wasn't preservation, it was polemics. That right there is 1,000 red flags.
And you don't even have to take my word for it. This quote is from George Howard. He's the scholar who actually popularized the Shem Tov Matthew in modern times. Even its biggest fan, its #1 proponent, admitted that the text is not pure and that it has been contaminated. He's telling us himself that we can't trust it as the original.
Okay, let's get into the hard evidence. Exhibit A. If the Shem Tov text isn't an ancient original, its language should give it away. We should be able to trace its linguistic fingerprints back to other, later documents. Let's see what we find, because this is where the case against it becomes undeniable.
This right here, this is the smoking gun. On the left, you've got the 14th century Shem Tov. On the right, another Hebrew Matthew by a guy named Dutilit from the 16th century. Now, scholars know for a fact that Dutilit's version is a translation from Greek into Hebrew, and just look at the phrasing. It's identical in ways shouldn't be. For example, that phrase, by the angel, in Matthew 2:12, it's not in the Greek, yet both of these Hebrew versions have it. That doesn't happen by accident.
So let's be crystal clear about what this means. There is absolutely no way that an original first-century Hebrew text would perfectly match a 16th century translation from Greek. It's linguistically impossible. The only conclusion that makes any sense is that Shem Tov is not an ancient original. It's just part of a much later family of texts that were all derived from the Greek version.
Okay, so we've established it's a copy. But it gets worse. The text wasn't just copied, it was changed. This brings us to Exhibit B, the motive. Why would someone deliberately alter the text? Well, it turns out it was manipulated to fit a very specific theological agenda. I want to introduce you to a group called the Ebionites. They were an early sect with some very unique beliefs. They thought Jesus was just a human prophet, not divine. They completely rejected the virgin birth, and, crucially for our case, they were vegetarians and they only used the Gospel of Matthew. So they would have had a very strong motive to fix the text to line up with their doctrines. And what do we find when we look at the Shem Tov text?
The changes line up perfectly with Ebionite theology. Suddenly, John the Baptist isn't eating locusts, he's eating wafers or manna, a very convenient change for a vegetarian group, right? The text is altered to remove support for the virgin birth. And in Matthew 23, a command to obey the Pharisees is changed to obey Moses because the Ebionites couldn't stand the Pharisees. This isn't subtle, this is blatant theological tampering.
You know, this brings up a huge principle in textual analysis. People sometimes argue that Shem Tov is better because it seems more consistent. But that's actually one of the biggest signs of a fraud. Original, authentic texts are often a little rough around the edges. Texts that have been fixed to smooth everything out and solve all the theological problems are almost always the work of later editors, not the original author.
All right, so we've torn down the case for Shem Tov. Now let's build up the powerful case for what we already have, the canonical Gospel of Matthew, which scholars are confident was originally written in Greek. Turns out, the clues have been hiding in plain sight all along.
The scholarly consensus on this is really strong, and for good reason. First, Matthew copies huge sections of the Gospel of Mark, which was written in Greek, often word for word. Second, when Matthew quotes the Old Testament, he often uses the Greek translation, the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. I mean, why would you do that if you were writing in Hebrew? On top of that, the quality of the Greek is excellent, it just doesn't read like a clunky translation.
And here it is, the final nail in the coffin. After all the theories and all the claims, what about the actual physical proof? The number of Hebrew Matthew manuscripts from the first few centuries that have ever been discovered is exactly 0. Not a single one, not even a fragment. The hard evidence simply doesn't exist.
So, after reviewing all the evidence, the history, the linguistics, the theology, the lack of manuscripts, it's time to deliver the verdict on the Shem Tov Matthew and its claim to fame.
The case against it is just overwhelming. 1, it's a late medieval manuscript from the 14th century, not some ancient text from the 1st. 2, its own biggest promoter admitted it was hopelessly corrupted and contaminated. 3, the linguistic evidence proves it's part of a later translation tradition that comes from the Greek. And 4, it was theologically manipulated to support the doctrines of a fringe sect. Let's call it what it is. It's a fraud.
Now, does this mean the text is completely worthless? Not necessarily, but trusting it as the original is like going dumpster diving. Yeah, it's possible you might find a gold ring, some tiny authentic saying buried deep inside. But to find it, you have to dig through absolute mountains of medieval trash, corruption, and manipulation. It is not a reliable source, period.
So, I'll leave you with this final thought. The next time someone presents you with a text that's been conveniently fixed to solve all its problems and smooth out its theology, what does that really tell you? Is that the mark of a pure, authentic, original? Or is it the clearest possible sign of manipulation? The evidence speaks for itself.